hi, my name is Bhaskar Sarkar. I teach in the Film and Media Studies department here. And we just finished watching Nowhere from 1997. And I'm delighted to welcome Gregg Araki, the filmmaker. So when I say I'm delighted, my delights are manifold, as I hope you'll be able to figure out. So let's see. First question for you is very simply, what does it feel like to see this on 4K restored digital print after almost 30 years?
Well, we just did the 4K remaster of this film and also the Doom Generation this past year. And both movies, I mean, Nowhere in particular was never released on even DVD in the US. So through the years, all these decades, it's had this kind of cult following, and people are always thinking, when's Nowhere coming out? When's Nowhere coming out? And I was always go, well, one day, I'll get to it. And so finally, the kind of rights, it was distributed by Fine Line Features, which is a division of Warner Brothers. And so, finally the rights reverted to us, the distribution rights. And so we got the rights back, and then we had to track down all the elements. And then as my friend Marcus Hu at Strand Releasing, it was like a giant project to get the negative. We remixed the sound and went back to the original camera negative, totally remastered the picture. And it was such a thrill for me to be able to do Doom Generation and Nowhere, because both movies, it's interesting, we were talking about it in the green room, they've lived this very long life, and it's like these movies are. I mean, this audience is also very young. I mean, the audience was not even born when this movie came out, and your parents were, I guess, around, and it's sort of like how they know about this movie, and it's sort of lived this long life, and people are always asking about it, and but it's on the basis of just the copies, these kind of, like, Doom Generation was like not even letterbox, and it was like this Pan-scan, and it just didn't look good, and the mix wasn't good, and I look at these copies and just like kind of wince, and Nowhere also, because it was never released on DVD, it was released on VHS and Laserdisc of all formats, and the copies that exist are just these horrible bootlegs from like a Russian website, and so these movies have lived all this time, and are sort of beloved by the kind of cult following on the basis of just the worst versions imaginable. So I really wanted, just in terms of my own legacy, for there to be copies of the movie that I was happy with, and technically, as a filmmaker, kind of proud of, and didn't have to cringe every time I thought about some people watching them. So I was, very hands. It was just like being post on a movie. I went into the lab every day and supervised every single shot, every single part of the mix, and we had to go back and dig up to find where the songs, a lot of the songs were hard to find, and so we kind of redid the whole movie in post again.
And it's totally available?
Totally was actually remastered in I think 2005. It was the first one we remastered, but it actually needs it's not 4K. I think it's just whatever, HD or whatever it is, and but Totally Fucked Up is a different animal, because Fucked Up and Doom Gen and Living End are kind of the same. They're both shot on 16mm, very small crew, like me. Sometimes me and one other person, sometimes up to 5 people, but they both cost $20 grand or whatever. And then Doom Generation and Nowhere were both about $1 million, and they were my first movies in 35mm with a DP and a production designer and a full crew and everything. So the movies are always kind of in these weird little pairs. So.
How are you taking in the fact of the inclusion of this film in a series titled Revisiting the Classics? Is it that time?
It's oh yeah. Well, I'm 64 now, and it's just I think it comes I guess it comes with age. There's a level of also, because I just had these screenings. They screened the whole trilogy, Totally Fucked Up, Doom Generation, and Nowhere at the Academy Museum. I don't know if anybody's ever been there yet, at the Geffen Theater. It's probably, I think, one of the most amazing theaters in the United States. It's not quite the Palais in Cannes, but it's close. And so they screened all 3 movies there, and that's where we premiered the 4K remaster of Nowhere. So there's a level of, when Gregg Araki movies are getting screened at the Academy, there's a level of, oh yeah, you're kind of like, going to be dead soon. So time for the retrospective. So there's this level of sort of reflection, and that's why coming here is so kind of important and also, sentimental, because it really takes me back to, the career I've had and the places I've been and how I became who I am, and so much of that was here. We were just talking about in the green room. It's like I was a 19-year-old kid when I came here and got in the film studies department, and I was, sort of experimenting a little bit with my sexuality in a very sort of quiet, secret way. But in terms of, film studies and all the classes I took, it was so formative in terms of my identity of who I was, what I wanted to be as an artist, like what cinema was capable of, and it was such a kind of exciting and sort of inspiring period for me. And also, I was fortunate enough, I was here from 78 to 82, I think, and then I went to USC from 82 to 85. And it was right at the point of like post-punk music, new wave music. It was all just exploding and happening right at that time, right as I was at that age of like 18 to 22. So it was, the possibilities in that, and also that sensibility of punk music and that kind of DIY, just fuck the establishment, fuck the mainstream, just do your own thing, and, just march to your own drummer, and, it doesn't matter, like top 40 mainstream success, like all that. It was very much hand in hand with my education as a filmmaker. And, we were talking before the screening about, like, I had a Godard class, like, right before I went to USC, like, my last quarter here. And that was, like, huge to me.
Who taught that?
It was Michael Renoff, actually. And, just like all the auteur studies I did here, and just learning about all these like great filmmakers and what had been done. But that blending of sort of punk rock and cinema, the art of cinema at the same time, when you're like that age, right at the right moment. I mean, it was just really kind of like,
So theory, history, good.
I'm sorry?
Theory, history, good.
Yeah, I mean,
this is for you guys.
Yeah, it's just all for. I've been told that people complain about too much theory and too much history, but it's like my, again, I'm very much a product of my time. I think when I went to film school, because that was kind of also a weird. Chuck Will can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was also a really formative time for film studies, because that's the 70s was when film studies was just sort of young and a new study. And when I was here, it wasn't even a department yet. It was like an interdepartmental like thing. And so film studies was taking off, and it was all new and all exciting and all sort of groundbreaking. And so there was that level of, again, being kind of in the right place at the right time. And but it was really, for me, so much, even when I didn't, I was saying earlier, it's just like, when I first saw like Breathless or Passion Joan of Arc or whatever, like the classics, maybe I don't think I really understood them or didn't really get why I was watching them, but it was so important for me, that exposure, because I eventually did get them, and I was like, oh, now I get it. And it's when I sit down to write a script or work on a movie, that background, that history of film and cinema and all the auteurs and all of the, from that, advent of cinema on, and all of that stuff became such a part of my identity and my brain. And so I don't even really think about, direct, I mean, sometimes my movies have kind of direct homages. And we were talking about Design for Living earlier, the Lubitsch film from the 30s, and I kind of remade that movie in 1999 as a kind of modern version called Splendor, and it was the same dynamic. But those kind of things, the things I was super influenced by, they all sort of, pop up in my work, just kind of subconsciously almost. Chuck taught this Buster Keaton class that was a huge, huge influence on me, and I see it so much. Like when I was watching the beginning of this movie, those shots of those kind of wide shots of this sort of protagonist in this kind of hostile existential universe, like these big kind of static frames. Those are all just straight out of film school, and I feel like for me it was just such an advantage to have that sort of experience. Anyway.
So, Gregg entered my consciousness sometime in 89 or 90, I don't remember the exact year, at a double bill with Three Bewildered People in the Night and The Long Weekend at the New Art.
Wait, you seen the Long Weekend?
Yeah, and both together, and you were there. You were there, you looked a bit shy, a bit tongue-tied, perhaps a bit overwhelmed because it was all new attention. And I had so many questions, but I didn't have the language then to ask you.
Really? Wow, that's amazing.
Around this time, the moniker New Queer Cinema was coined by B. Ruby Rich, Patrice told us this before, and taken up by other scholars and critics to acknowledge something new, right? So when we talk about a new cinema, that means there's a kind of rupture or break with what went on before, and there's something novel. So it's about novelty, but it's sort of also about, marketing, right? A branding, a niche marketing here. It's about periodization, but it's also about a certain kind of ghettoization when you attach a film to a kind of minority identity. So my question is how do you place yourself in relation to this sort of designation? What was it then for you and what is it now? Has it changed?
It's definitely changed, I think, through the years. I mean, I do feel like there was a point at which it felt kind of ghettoizing, but, again, being older and wiser, sort of looking back in a sort of retrospective way, I think it was super important. The idea, particularly because I understand better now how the landscape of cinema works and how the landscape of independent cinema works. I think if The Living End had just come out on its own as this little tiny 16 millimeter Sundance movie that sort of caused a little bit of commotion when it came out, without the context of nuclear cinema, because there was so much attention and so much critical attention to nuclear cinema. Without that context, I think it would have just kind of been more of a blip. But now the idea that historically there's this thing called nuclear cinema and Swoon and Poison and The Living End and Go Fish and all these movies, it's now exists within a sort of continuum of cinema, as opposed to if it was just this one stray movie kind of living out there. So I appreciate being part of that. And thinking about what you're talking about, it wasn't a real, I always would say this in interviews and stuff, sort of fighting back against it, because it wasn't a true new wave. It wasn't like the French New Wave where Godard and Truffaut and they all sort of sat around and said this is our dogma, this is what we want to do, this is how we want to change cinema. It was always a lot of young artists feeling kind of alienated, and particularly it was very tied to sort of the AIDS crisis and what was going on politically and socially at that time. Feeling just very despairing, frustrated, angry, all of these emotions. And so it was all of these individual artists sort of coincidentally at that time reacting to this sort of social issue that's why it all kind of happened in 91, 92.
In a way, acknowledging the despair, but also kind of trying to move beyond, right? It's some of these films are so in your face, they let everything hang out, so to speak. And and the kind of like sex positive attitude, that's really quite key to this.
Yeah, it was, it was very, it was very closely related to the rise of ACT UP and Queer Nation and all that stuff. Is this idea of gay people, particularly gay men, being sort of literally exterminated. And so there was a necessity to sort of, fight back and speak up and, be angry, be on the streets and be all that. So, the films were very much kind of an extension of that. In fact, like Tom Kalin was very active. Tom Kalin, Todd Haynes, all of those New York filmmakers were very in those.
But seeing this after a while, I was thinking also how it's so effortlessly non-binary. Doesn't make a big deal out of it, right? Like it just is. And maybe that's one of the reasons why this is becoming big again, like people kind of feel like this, it speaks to them in certain ways.
Yeah, interesting, I was talking about this earlier, is that, a lot of non-binary kids, I guess, find something in the work that they really appreciate. I think part of it is there was a level of, and this wasn't really in the culture, it was just more in my sensibility and in my head. There's this level of just kind of openness and fluidity in particularly these movies, like Doom Generation, where they're not that gay with a capital G. They're very just kind of fluid, and people just kind of like in this movie how the Rachel True character has a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and Jimmy's got a girlfriend and he's in love with a boy. It's just like this idea that it's all kind of free floating and all no labels and stuff.
Did you always want to become a filmmaker? And how did you get here? We kind of talked about that a bit, but if there's anything more.
No, when I first started at UC Santa Barbara, I was actually a pre-vet major, and it was really, but I was very artistic at the same time. And I used to actually want to draw comic books. I was very into, like, when I was a kid, I used to draw comics all the time. And so once I was at UCSB, it was when the film studies department, again, was just sort of kind of being born and taking off. And I kind of came in and I took a few classes, and I thought, oh, this is really, cinema. It was just like, it's hard to, it's hard to think about as an old person. This time where cinema was very, felt new, and it felt like it was the happening art form. It was very, because this is the late '70s, and I remember, it's when movies like Days of Heaven were like playing in a movie theater, Like there was a level of these sort of auteurs working, and this, it was at the tail end of the, Hollywood heyday of the '70s, where there was a bit of a, anti-establishment disruption going on. So, it was just a super exciting time.
First two films made on budgets of 5,000, third probably 20,000.
Third and the fourth.
Third and fourth, okay. So tell them a bit about what it is like to be working on such shoestring budgets in the shadow of Hollywood. And how much of a deterrent is that? Or is it like inspiring in some ways?
It was very, like, again, I think it was very from my sort of punk rock background. It was just, I didn't really think about it. I was just really, at the time when I made the 5,000 movies, I was very positioned as like anti-Hollywood, like there's an infamous quote of me from probably that period when I was very like angry and very like nervous, and where I was saying, like, if somebody gave me $100,000, I'd make 20 movies. It's just like the idea being that I'm a punk rock rebel, and I'm not interested in, because particularly at that time, I made my first two movies in the mid-'80s, which is when, I don't know, for me, again, I was young, I was angry, I was, just this punk rock artsy kid who'd seen a lot of Godard movies. I was very like, it was a lot of like terms of endearment. Like Hollywood to me was so fucking like, the movies at that period were so kind of...
On Golden Pond.
Yeah, on Golden Pond, like...
Out of Africa.
I remember actually the long weekend was actually, I remember in the press material, I would because I used to make my own press kits and write my own synopses and all this stuff. And I remember it being kind of an anti-Big Chill, because the Big Chill had come out as this sort of like, oh, the nostalgic, like good, happy, like remember the 60s, the good old days movie. And I was like, F that, it's just like, so yeah, so that's in that period, that was, a part of my
I remember your
aesthetic.
quote, what was it, about Totally F***ed Up. It's my most Godard damaged film.
Well, I mean, Totally F***ed Up is very much kind of a gay, lesbian, queer version of Masculine Feminine. It actually quotes that movie in there's a lot of quotations from that movie, and it's one of my favorite movies of all time.
I've always marveled about the extent to which the spaces of Southern California in general and LA in particular figure as palpable presence in all your, not all, but many of your films. They almost function as a kind of, character in so many of your films, including this one and those particularly this and Totally F***ed Up, and then later ones too. Did you simply let Los Angeles play itself, or was it certain kind of places and spots and locations that attracted you? Here it's obviously the kind of vista from the top that you keep going.
Yeah, I mean, LA is kind of my city, the way that, Paris was Godard's city. And it's, I was born in Los Angeles. I grew up here in I always say Santa Barbara, but actually Goleta, like right over there. So I grew up in Goleta. We moved here when I was like 5 or 6 years old. But my heart's always been kind of in Los Angeles. And I remember when I was here going to UCSB, I would go down there for shows like all the time. And LA's always been just very kind of near and dear to my heart. One thing I love about LA is that it's very kind of Lynchian and very surreal. And a friend of mine in film school once said, like, LA is like living inside a big cartoon, and that's what it's like. It's just like you see the weird, and like nobody bats an eye, and that's one thing I don't like about living in like a small town. I don't like people, you walk in a restaurant and like looking at you like, oh, look at that freak, or look at that weirdo, or I mean, in LA, like literally you can walk like blue, like covered in blue paint, naked down the street, and people don't really give a shit. And I think that's kind of one of the things about LA that appeals to me. And a big part of my movies is this level of kind of surrealism and stylization, and the idea that the characters are kind of walking through like almost like a hallucination. And Los Angeles is very, very much like that. I mean, even the real settings, because in the early movies, like Totally F***ed Up and Living End, and the black and white ones, the two early ones, there was no budget for production design, for sets, for locations, for nothing. We would literally just go to these places and film. And I'm thinking about in Three Bullet People and also Totally F***ed Up, there's a lot of scenes in like parking garages, which is always one of my favorite settings, because they just feel so kind of strange. Dune was playing last night on the TV, and like that, they feel like Dune. They feel like this severe, strange, alien kind of landscape, which is something that I'm always drawn to. And in the days when I was making movies with no money, I would literally keep a notebook in my car of like, oh, the corner of such and such and such and such, just a giant pile of trash, or a building that's falling over, or some weird billboard. Like I would constantly be looking for these kind of visual things to stick in the movies, just so that it wasn't just like two people in a room.
Yeah, all these non-places like strip malls and convenience stores, which you constantly go to, inhabit, but you can't belong to, right? You're passing through always, kind of. It's interesting that you brought up the cartoon, that LA is like a cartoon thing. I'll come to that in a minute, but commentators have actually talked a lot about the kind of persistent nihilism that mark your films, particularly before 2000. And you talked about being a punk rock rebel, all with story ideas and scripts by you until then. But alongside the I don't give a attitude of so many characters, there is also this core of vulnerability. And I'm kind of struggling to kind of make this point here, but hopefully you'll understand what I mean. Like a palpable loneliness of yearning, often without, yearning without a specific target. So kind of generalized sense of longing or yearning that seems to be inspired by and appropriate for these kind of spaces. So I'm remembering, for instance, the Twilight scene from the Doom generation where James Duval's character walks slightly hunched, like against this amazing skyline, and he's like has this lit yo-yo, and that unfurls and springs back. It's an incredible scene. It stuck with me, and this one, the Jeremy Jordan's in a room with all the writings. So if you could speak a little bit about this kind of weird, conflicting affects that you seem to manage to kind of give us.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I remember, my films frequently get labeled as nihilistic, and I always sort of bristled at that a little bit because particularly Doom Generation came out literally like at the same time as Kids, Larry Clark's Kids. And to me, I would always say, Kids to me is nihilistic. I mean, those movies are so super dark. And my movies are always, to me, driven by more of kind of romanticism. Like and that's why for the trilogy, Totally Fucked Up, Doom, and Nowhere, Jimmy's sort of at the center of them, James Duval, and he represents to me this sort of, and especially in Nowhere, just like this, he's so vulnerable, so like innocent and naive, and just like this bleeding heart, and just like longing, yearning for like somebody out there somewhere, and that's very much a part of all my movies. And I actually, I've done a lot of interviews through the years, and it's to me very much like the band like Jesus and Mary Chain, which is a sort of post-punk band that, I don't know, does anybody know who Jesus and Mary Chain are here? Their music is very kind of like chaotic and intense, but the center of their songs is always about yearning and longing for love and loneliness, and that's something that to me is very, very much a part of my work. And I've talked about it a lot already, but music is so important to me, and I'm always listening to music, like literally 24 hours a day. Like during the screening, I was in the green room, like kind of working on a script and like listening to music. Like I always listen. So that music is so much a part of like my sensibility, and when I sit down to think of something, it's always there.
Would you say that 1980s, 90s LA's club scene played a role in shaping the look and feel of your? I mean, this whole thing of like, where is that juju whatever party going on? I mean, that kind of looking for party.
Yeah, it's funny. And one of my French producers was always like, why are there so many party scenes in your movie? There's always like a party. Like, why are so many parties all the time? Yeah, and no, I said the music is like, I spent all of my youth in clubs and going to shows, and my company is called Desperate Pictures, which is named after a X song that I saw X here like I don't know 50 times. I've seen them so many times, and so I've always been so into that music, and that's one of the things about Nowhere in particular. It's kind of like almost a culmination of all of that, like the music and the culture and the queer parts of it. And that's why I used to love to go to Coachella, particularly in the sort of golden age of Coachella, because it was, for me, Coachella was like Nowhere, like come to life. You know what I mean? Like it was all these beautiful kids, and they're all like boys, girls, like that love boys and girls. Like it was all very like sexually amorphous, and like music everywhere, and it was just like this kind of utopian thing. And that's one of the things about the movies, I think, is that because that music is so much a part of it, it's something that is always, they definitely kind of go hand in hand.
And the soundtracks to your films are something else because they're so lovingly curated. And it was a pain to see your films because, this was pre-Shazam days, so I had no way of figuring out what it was. And until I kind of tracked down the CD or the cassette tape or whatever, that didn't know what it was. But I got to know Verve, I was telling you, also Slow Dive, and all these bands that I've since loved. So Do you ever want to be a DJ? Have you ever DJed?
No, I always said I actually wanted to be in a band. Like it's like being a director is almost like secondary. It's like, if I could have played an instrument, I could have been in a band. But it was the music was so much a part of that. You know what I mean? It's like it was so much a part of what I, as a filmmaker, wanted to say and how I was going to say it.
Mm-hmm. The trilogy you described as 90210, Beverly Hills on Acid. Of course, there's some conscious overlap in casting, Shannon Doherty and Kathleen Robertson. And Jeremy Jordan, I remember, he came on 90210 to peddle his music album.
And Tori Spelling, he says, "It's Jeremy Jordan."
I remember that too, yeah. That was kind of funny and odd. Speaking of acid,
okay.
Some critics and viewers have sensed an increasingly harsh tone across your, and let me say this, you're probably already bristling. So the storylines become more bleak, the characters sort of get more snarky. At the time Nowhere was released, a friend of mine remarked that while you had a lot of empathy and love and care for the characters of, say, Totally F***ed Up, by this time, by Nowhere, you were a little bit more impatient with people like that. Now, is that true? I don't know. What would you say now? And would that be a different response then?
One of the major things I learned in film school, it's just the cinema's just so subjective. It's the dialectic between the audience member and the spectacle. So, I personally think Nowhere is. Doom Generation is definitely of the trilogy the harshest and the bleakest, and I call it kind of my Nine Inch Nails movie. It's very angry and very intense.
It's also my favorite.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, people are like, that's why I love that one. Nowhere to me is actually a little more utopian, a little more. I was again, it has to do with music. Doom Generation was very kind of industrial music, Nine Inch Nails, and very kind of angry, very chaotic. By the time Nowhere came around, I was in the 90s. I got more and more, and Splendor's like sort of the extension of this, more and more into like electronic music, not the rave scene per se. I wasn't really going to raves, but that sensibility, which was much more kind of utopian, much more kind of free love and free sexuality, and so Nowhere was not as bleak to me as Doom Generation, but Doom Generation is definitely bleak. And then every movie comes from a different place. I specifically kind of me just feeling so terrible for gay and lesbian and queer teenagers in that period, because it was a lot like today. Just horrible stories about kids committing suicide and this kind of homophobia and these horrible Republican senators like Jesse Helms is he makes a cameo in this movie. These people that were just the level of hatred and the level of bigotry was sort of horrifying, and the idea that these young kids in these sort of formative years of their life were dealing with this. So that's kind of where Totally F***ed Up came from, my desire to portray that. And then Doom Generation was probably a little more film school in the sense that it was a couple on a run movie, one of my favorite genres from film school, and kind of a little bit of a design for living thing going on with the two boys and the girl. And so, and it literally, again, it's all film school. Like in the page one of the Doom Generation script is like, Amy Blue has an Anna Karina haircut. And they say that about Pulp Fiction too, that, did Quentin steal, Uma Thurman's haircut from Doom Generation? No, he's a Anna Karina fan too. When we go back to the source, we don't quote a movie that was like yesterday. It's like we're quoting the cool from the 60s.
So my dear colleague Dick Hebditch, who retired a couple of years ago, writing about the Japanese and East Asian in general pop culture, talks about figures like Hello Kitty as at once sadistic and masochistic and cute. So he termed them pseudo-cute.
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 Okay, I like that.
They're almost sadistic in their cuteness, yeah. So some of these characters
That's
are
very Amy Blue from Doom Generation.
This
Like,
is- yeah.
that was one of the things about that character, and that's why it was so hard to cast, is I really wanted her to be tiny, like this tiny little cute thing, driving this big car, just like foul its mouth and just like a hellion, but just like this little tiny cute thing. Anyway.
Yeah,
Pseudo-cute.
Yeah. So they have a kind of like flatness to them at first, but that is, I think, your mode of defamiliarizing them and refusing us some of the usual hooks through which we identify with them, but then you kind of hook us back in other ways. And so like that is really interesting. I don't know how you do it, if you have anything to say about that, but what I wanted to ask definitely is casting. The casting is really interesting. I forgot about John Ritter here in this film. I mean, all these TV personalities, Doom Generation at the end, the MAGA type people are like redneck killers, are all porn stars, gay porn stars of that period. Tracy Lords shows up here. Ryan Phillippe, Heather Graham, Nathan Brexton, Jonathan Shake. These are really good-looking people in a kind of pin-up model plastic way. And I don't mean plastic in a bad way at all. So, I mean, what is that strategy in casting? And Jeremy Jordan is amazing here. I mean, I'd forgotten how good he is. I don't think he's the greatest actor, but I think it must be the way you used him. He was just pitch perfect. So something about casting and, you know, that kind of use of...
Yeah, casting is a huge part of my movies. One of the things about filmmaking for me is it's, you know, the cliche about it being like 99% casting. It's completely true. You know, it's like directing, you know, I'm not a director that like, you know, I go up to my actors like, oh, you're a lion in the forest. And I mean, it's like literally you're just looking for the people that bring it. You know what I mean? Like they just have it in them. You know what I mean? Like you're looking for that thing and that spark. It's not, I don't on set like, okay, you're a lump of clay and I'm going to make you into this. It's like I'm always looking for that, you know, that sort of the movie star quality. It's just like, an example I give is when I was casting Kaboom in 2008 or 9, like Juno Temple came in and she was actually not right for the part, but I just loved her. Like I couldn't take my eyes off her, and so I sort of actually adjusted the part for her a little bit, and it's that it's you know, movies are looking at somebody for 90 minutes or whatever, and it's like people that you can't take your eyes off them, and that's kind of something that I always look for. And in terms of Doom Generation and Nowhere, there, you know, the reason for all those like people like the porn stars and John Ritter and Tracy Lords and Charlotte Ray from The Facts of Life, I would tell my casting directors that it wasn't really about cameos for me. It was really about surrealism and the idea of when you sort of have these dreams and like random people are in your dreams from just culture. You know, Lindsay Lohan's in your dream for some crazy reason. You know what I mean? The idea that when you're dreaming, like these faces out of culture just sort of pop up. And that's kind of what I wanted. I wanted the movies to feel like kind of like a dream or a nightmare where these strange people are coming up in a different context.
And LA is a little like that. Remember Angeline? I actually ran into her one time and it was really, really freaky because you don't think he's real.
Yeah, it's just like, it's like a cartoon. Like
Yeah.
you're like, wait, you're actually a person?
Tyler and I were talking about how, you know, the 1990s has become this sort of nostalgia. There's just so much
The new
nostalgia
nostalgia.
around, and many of you wear clothes that you see here in this film, right? Like, I mean, what's that about? It's really interesting, and you're saying that many of the screenings are really filled up now.
Yeah, it's just like when we did, because Doom Generation and Nowhere both got re-released this year theatrically, and Jimmy and I went around to several of the places and cities, and every screening was like at least half. I always ask before the screenings, like, how many people have never seen this movie before? And always it was at least half, sometimes more, sometimes like 75, 80% were like new people. So it was really somehow the word of mouth about the movie. I've heard it's like on TikTok and Vine, what all this shit I don't know anything about. So yeah, it's like there's this weird level of like these, 16, 17-year-old kids that know what nowhere is and want to watch it.
And was Andrea Sperling really a councilwoman at any point?
Was she what?
Councilwoman? That's what you said? Or was it just
No,
a joke?
Andrea Sperling was a student at UC
And
Santa
she was your
Barbara.
producer too.
Yeah, and became my, when I taught a little class here in indie cinema back in, that was like, it was actually before Living In, so it was early 90s, like 90, 91. And Andrew Sperling was in my class. Rocco Bellic, who was in Totally Hooked Up, was in my class. Dave Cash was in the class. He did a lot of horrible grunt production work on Living In. So yeah, it was but we had a whole class about indie cinema.
It's been quite the career, and I'm sure you'll keep on checking.
It ain't over yet, we hope.
I know, absolutely. But there must have been disappointments and setbacks at some point. And I don't, I'm bringing this up because students will have to struggle as they go into the industry. Do you have any pithy advice for them?
My case is everybody's on their own journey and their own path. And one thing about me, again, because of how I grew up, and I come from working class family, and and because of my punk rock nature, it's just one of the things about me, and I think this is not really prevalent amongst this generation, although there may be some people out there, is that I was always viewed myself as a starving, struggling artist. I've always viewed myself that way. And I've never been into, I don't have kids, I don't live in a huge house, I've never really been into material things. And for Hollywood, it's a very, those dreams are related, the idea that success and Oscar and mansions and I've always just approached it just from a purely artistic standpoint, and and in that way I've kind of had no disappointments. Honestly,
awesome.
I look back on my career and I think of myself as a 18-year-old UCSB student, just what is in my whatever intro to cinema class, film studies 49 or whatever it was, and just being so wide-eyed and not knowing who I was, what I was going to do. If I could have told a person that all of this is going to happen to you, you're going to make all of these movies, you're going to go to the Cannes Film Festival, you're going to make this TV show, you're going to do this, do that, it was just blown away by my good fortune. But so much of filmmaking in Hollywood is just being lucky and being in the right place. It's sad, but it's a kind of a crapshoot that way. One thing that is helpful, I think, for some people in this audience, but maybe not so helpful for others, I almost hate to say it, is that when I was, growing up, being a queer person of color was not in the cards in terms of being directors by the whole. We were talking about this earlier today in the green room too. Were white, straight, older men. All of the pantheon, Godard, Hitchcock, David Lynch, all of them. They're all middle-aged white, straight men. So, being a queer person of color, was kind of, for me, again, super, super helpful, because it made me who I was. It made me individual. It made me have my own voice. And I think that is different now. I do think that, being a subculture, I think, is actually an advantage. I know that's sad for the white, straight men in this audience, but being a woman, being of color, being non-binary, being whatever it is, it's there is a desire now for those stories, and I think that's fantastic.
Fantastic. Questions? Tyler's going to moderate them, right?
I was curious as to your punk rock influence. Where and what shows did you end up seeing? Did you see shows at Casa de la Raza, or did you go to the Living Room, or what bands were you influenced by?
I was just saying, this is the heyday of new wave punk rock. Like it wasn't really punk, it was more new wave. But all these bands used to come here. I saw like at the Pretenders in Bow Wow and like Suburban Lawns and all at an old gym right there, which I guess they're gonna tear down. They used to have shows in the Commons or the cafeteria or something. They just moved the chair. It was just such a cool time. And the bigger bands like Talking Heads or whatever would play the Arlington, or Campbell Hall had a lot of shows. It was incredible. And they all came to Santa Barbara. It wasn't like I used to have to go to LA a lot, to see whatever. Like I saw X at the Whiskey and all those places. But it was just such a cool time to be young. I hate to make it sad for young people today, but I mean, it wasn't, it's like, it wasn't Taylor Swift. It was, it was cool, and it was really like, as a young person, it was very, very inspiring. I'm just like, these weird artsy people just that weren't much older than we were, just doing their thing, and it definitely was a big influence for me.
Hello.
Over here, okay.
I kind of have a question about the distribution of the film. You talked a little bit about how one of the films you'd like to remaster was totally up, but I was wondering if you thought, or like maybe what was the film that you'd like to kind of have come out, or you'd maybe like to do next in terms of remaster? Because I know at least like Smiley Face, it's one of my favorite movies of yours.
Aww.
I had to like scour the pages of eBay to get the DVD for that, and so I was wondering if there was maybe
Do you
any
like
of
pot?
the films. Oh yeah, I have it in my bag. I have it right here. Wait, hold on. Here, I'll pull it out. I actually brought it with me. I bought your remasters now, but I know that like Criterion did the 3 films on Gregg Araki on Criterion, and so I was wondering if maybe there was one that you were hoping really hard that would get remastered, you would get to do again on like a bigger or like a better format.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I love that Doom and Noah remastered. Honestly, I think we're doing Mysterious Skin next, is just what I've heard. Oh, thank you. It's like, it's super fun to go back and like look at these movies, but I do still feel like I'm kind of have a day job, and like I'm kind of interested in doing the next thing, so I'm trying to do. I have a couple things I'm working on right now, but there's one of the things too about being like whatever starting artist is that it's just me. Like I don't have a company. I'm not like Christine Lachon or somebody who has like a whole company and staff and this and a building and developing. Like when I develop a project, it's like me sitting in there in a room writing it somewhere. And it's like, so, I love being able to go back and do Doom Generation again and Nowhere again, because I really wanted there to be copies of that movie for future audiences to see. And we're actually doing a box set of the whole trilogy on Criterion. So that's another project we're working on, and we're going to dig up all this old stuff for the box set. But I think we're going to do Mysterious Skin and hopefully Smiley Face. I love that movie and love Anna Faris, and every movie. I don't have kids, but every movie to me is a kid, and every movie to me is so many memories and so many experiences, and that one was super special.
Looks like we are done. A couple of things I want to say very quickly is that. I was thinking about the ways in which I said, sometimes it's a little harsh, but you kind of like anticipated some of the things that have gone on since then, the hipsterism, the influencers even. I was also thinking the courses that your characters seem to be taking in Nowhere. I took note of this. History of epidemics and thermonuclear catastrophes. This is pretty prescient, right? Like 1997. Already the writing was on the wall for you. I've followed your career as a fan for a very long time, and I've danced around you for a very long time. Great to meet you finally, and it's an absolute pleasure to hear you talk about your work.
Great to meet you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.